This podcast is designed to assist faculty assessors in supporting faculty members to successfully apply for a consultant post by giving information on interview preparation, constructive feedback on interview performance, and careers advice. I'm Ellis Friedman, the faculty registrar and an experienced faculty assessor, and I'm joined on this podcast by
Fatai, Ogunlayi, and I'm a recent consultant appointee.
Merla, a recent consultant appointee who gained from my experience of faculty assessor feedback.
And I'm Aimee Stimpson. I'm the Assistant Registrar at the Faculty of Public Health and, like Ellis, an experienced faculty assessor.
Thank you. So my first question is, what are the key elements of good interview preparation and common mistakes that the assessor may want to address with the candidate?
Thanks, Ellis. Great opening question there. So I think I'm going to kick off with talking about a really common mistake, which is not doing your pre-interview preparation. So making contact with the employer, talking to the DPH, if possible and feasible, visiting the DPH. I know we're at home more in offices as well, but really getting that local knowledge around the patch before interview. And then you can use that knowledge during your presentation, which is likely to be part of it, but also the employers will want to see that local knowledge, that evidence of research as well. And so much information is now available online. There's loads of useful documents you'll be able to look at, whether that's the JSNA, health and wellbeing strategies, ICB plans, health profiles. Even I would expect candidates to have looked at health and wellbeing board agendas and papers and the public health outcomes framework. It's all available online, and just to have a flavour of really what's topical for that, and the employers will expect to see that. They want to see interest in their organisation and their place. And I think, again, employers, they really want to see the positive rationale for your application. Why have people applied for this job specifically? Make it relevant to the job, and then really that's what employers want to hear. And employers also don't want to see applications that have got spelling mistakes or are incomplete, are too generic as well. So employers will be looking for that, and I think that will be made clear in the adverts as well.
Thank you. So, Aimee, what would you say are the common issues which often require feedback in regard to the presentation part of the interview?
Thanks, Ellis. Delivery and structured responses, are really common, sadly, I think to say, and I think it's all about practice and being confident. So employers will want to see you as a credible leader who can fit into their organisation, their team and their system. So, really think about that. Employers will be looking for that confidence. These are senior posts in local authorities or in the NHS or in regional organisations as well. So you have to be seen as that credible person. I think another common mistake is not knowing the audience. So I would encourage people not to use too much jargon. You don't want people trying to work out what the jargon is, and actually you want people to be listening to the answers as well. And, that considering the use of jargon will avoid potential follow-up questions as well. Another common issue is around timekeeping. You will know the length of the interview, the employer knows the length of the interview as well. So think about 2 to 3 or maybe 4-minute answers to questions. That is how long you're going to be able to hold the audience for. That's what the employer wants to hear. They don't want to hear long unstructured rambling answers to presentations or interview questions as well. Nor do we want to be shown really poor materials that anybody could have put together in 5 minutes. Things have been shown on screen that are too small to read, that don't make any sense. And again, it's about that demonstrating that local knowledge as well. And employers, they will not want you to read from slides as well. So bring slides to life, really demonstrate that leadership. And I think that's what employers have fed back to me when I've sat on AACs before. Thanks, Ellis.
Thanks, Aimee. Some really good suggestions there. And I think also it might be helpful for the assessors to feedback, particularly for registrars who are coming off training, who may be sounding too theoretical. We, as registrars, we get very used to trying to answer the Part A question or the DFPH questions. And if that comes through in an interview, I think it's really helpful for the assessor to feed that back if we're being too theoretical, if we're being too high level, or we're just missing the point, or just missing the how part of the question. Is we get really bogged down into trying to pour all the knowledge we have about a particular subject onto the slides, and often forget the bit that asks, and what would you do? What would your contribution be? What would you try to change? So I think it's really useful if assessors feed that back to just help ground some of our preparation in real life about working in a local public health organization. Thanks.
Thanks. Some very useful tips, I hope, for you assessors. So turning then to the next part of the interview, what would you say are the common issues which require feedback in terms of answering questions?
Okay, so as an assessor, in terms of feeding back about questions, structure, I talked about it earlier in the previous question, poor structure to your interview questions, rambling answers, too long. There's a real skill in being concise and really focusing and holding the audience as well. So we've talked earlier in a previous podcast about using frameworks to support answers and structuring answers. And I think that's really good to feedback to candidates when they've been successful or unsuccessful. There's loads of support available online. That lack of local knowledge, I think as well, that's a common thing I hear from employers. It's something I do tend to feedback all the time. There's really no excuse for not knowing some local information about the system and place you're applying for. And I think there's also something around about how you present yourself as well. Remember, this is a formal interview. You might be doing it on screen, but, really show that you've prepared, think about everything from your positions, your answers, and that can, those non-verbal signs are really important that faculty assessors and employers will pick up on, and it's a common thing that we do feedback for people as well. And then that just lack of a compelling narrative. We really want to hear from you. Assessors really want to hear from you. Why do you want this job? What do you bring? What are your skills? Why do we want to appoint you rather than the other candidates they're appointing as well? So I think assessors will often feed back around that as well if there isn't that structure, that local knowledge, or that compelling narrative. We will have read your applications. We will read those applications, but you want to hear from the person during the interview as well. So as an assessor, that's something I often feedback on. So I think my last point really is about, do practice and encourage people to practice if their answers weren't that where they needed to be for the interview. Do a mock interview. I often encourage people to do that. Some people will want to record themselves, that can be one way, but get an experienced peer or consultant to help you with that. People are actually willing to help and give people that little bit of time if you'll just ask them as well. So I think those are some common things. Fatai, did you want to add as well from your perspective?
Yes, thank you. Those are some really good suggestions that would help candidates. Just to emphasize that point you made about structured answers, I think assessors feeding that back would be really, really helpful for candidates, because we sometimes undervalue just how important it is to have a structured answer to the question that's being asked. So some of those feedback would be really helpful. The other thing that I think assessor might want to feedback is just how much nerves play in the decision that they make. Because as candidates, we are overwhelmed with nerves. Some of us try to keep it under, some of us it boils over, but it would be really good to hear from assessors just how much does the nerve play in their decision making. Obviously, if a candidate seems to have been completely overwhelmed by the nerves, then they want to feed that back. But if it's sometimes where we over-exaggerate in our mind just how nervous we think we're coming across, then the assessor will be really reassuring to say, of course you were nervous, but it didn't affect your performance. Because that's really important for the next stage, to know that nerves will be part of it, but it wouldn't necessarily deter or impact on their performance on the day. Thanks, Aimee.
thanks for those useful tips. Now, we have the term compelling narrative mentioned there, and Anna, I think it would be useful to remind the listeners about what is meant by a compelling narrative.
Yes, Ellis, thank you. A compelling narrative is intended as an opportunity for the candidate to describe what they're most proud of in a fluent and succinct way, with particular focus on achievements and successes throughout their career. Usually it is recommended to choose from accomplishments that have been objectively valued or that have made a difference. For example, a peer review article, a grant obtained, a paper published, or a service implemented which is still in operation. The candidate should be able to explain lucidly what their contribution was to the task by using a structured way, providing first a general definition, followed by a detailed description of the facts and outcomes, including lessons learned. The compelling narrative typically covers between 10 and 12 common question areas, such as leadership, team working, partnership working, managing within resources, health inequalities, dealing with difficult colleagues, working in a political environment, and so on. Usually these areas are listed in the job description, and that's why the candidates are asked to read through, are advised to read through it carefully so that they are aware of what is expected.
And if I may add to that, Ellis, really good idea, suggestions there. And I wonder also whether it would be helpful for the assessors to feedback to candidates where they've used a lot of "we did this," and then it's difficult for the panel to figure out and what was the candidate's contribution. Of course, public health is a collaborative space and you work with other people, but I think that it would be really helpful for assessors to let candidates know that they really want to hear what was your contribution specifically to come through as part of that compelling narrative that Anna so eloquently described to us. Thanks.
Thank you. So, Aimee, the outcome of the AACs clearly can't be changed. Presumably, as an assessor, you're trying to motivate people to better prepare for future applications if they've been unsuccessful.
I think we can all say we've been unsuccessful at times in interviews. You know, we've all been there. But I think as the role of the assessor, it is to give that constructive feedback to the unsuccessful candidates as well, to help them plan for the future. You know, I probably don't even need to say this, but we need to be sensitive. It can, you know, people will have put a lot of time and effort into their application as well, but it's really important that they're able to move on, to reflect on the interview, and then they can perform and improve on their next interview. So what I tend to think about is ensuring that I maintain some positive aspects of the interview process, think about the questions they answered well, and then think about some of the areas they might want to improve on as well. And how I've done this, and other people do things differently, is actually start the feedback session with actually asking the candidate what they thought went well or what didn't go so well as well, and see where they are with the process, see if they recognise their strengths and areas for improvement as well. That can be really helpful, and that will really then frame the rest of the conversation as well. And I think as assessors, we have a role really in being specific in our feedback. You know, we should be talking about strong answers, that might be around the system leadership, or some of the technical answers around the portfolio, and then talk about the questions where people didn't score so highly on, and then really explore did they choose the right example? You know, was it an example where they talked too much, like Fatai said, about we rather than their role? Was it too old an example as well, or just not relevant to the role? So start to explore that session with them in the feedback session as well. And I think there are some times when I've interviewed people and then provided feedback that they're just not a good match for the role that they've applied for as well. So I think people should, you know, read the application, read their advert and talk to the DPH to make sure, is this the right role for them, for their skill set, and for where they are in their career in public health as well. So, you know, I would often suggest people, if they're unsuccessful and it wasn't a good match, to talk to their coach and mentor, use peer learning sets, action learning sets as well, you know, because we're all developing, you know, we're developing continually as well, isn't it? So I think that support from peers can be really helpful. And then just thinking about the unsuccessful times as well, it is going to be disappointing as well. So I try not to give faculty feedback immediately after the interview. Have that space from having had the, sorry, you're not appointed to this post from the employer, and then maybe think about the faculty feedback as well. So people have had time to sort of digest it and think about it, and hopefully thought about reflections and where they could have done better as well. So I think there's something about the timing of that as well, because they may have be, you know, coming to their end of their training period. They may have had quite a few unsuccessful interviews recently, so you know it's going to be disappointing for them. But the role of the assessor rather, is to really help people for those future interviews and try and leave the feedback session feeling motivated with a clear course of actions that they can take to help them for the future. I think what I try to do as an assessor as well is agree with the employer or the DPH prior to the interview what the bar is, so that we can feed back to candidates on whether they could have been appointed if there hadn't been better candidates on the day. So it can be really important as an assessor to work with the panel about whether the candidates were appointable, and that can be really useful, so you know if you've met the bar, I think, as well. Think about their strengths and how they can use those strengths to improve their future successes in the future. That compelling narrative, it's been a theme of this podcast as well, you know, really get people to think about that. And whether you've done the UK PHR route or the faculty route, look at your people should have those examples, encourage people to go back to those and shape those examples and choose the right examples for future interviews as well. I think that's a really important role as well. And then trying to conclude by bringing people on to focus on the future as well. That interview's done, and as you said, Ellis, it can't be changed the outcome, isn't it? So it's how do they prepare for the next interview as well to maximise their successes as well. So hopefully leave them with some actions and a plan for the future. And there's loads of information online as well to help people. You know, there's faculty information about questions and job descriptions. There's interview frameworks. You know, as assessors, we need to signpost people to all of those resources available as well.
Thank you. If I may add a couple of things to that, that was really comprehensive. But there's a couple of things that resonated really well with me, and this is coming back from some of the feedback I've heard from other registrars who've gone through interview and who've been told they were unsuccessful, but there was nothing they could have done. And there's nothing more disappointing than that. And actually what you've described there was a really useful framework that assessors can use to feedback. So if it was a case of they didn't meet the bar, the minimum bar, then actually it's helpful to know that as a candidate. If it's a case of they exceeded the bar, but somebody else was just a better candidate on the day, that's also equally useful. And the other thing that you said that I thought was really helpful is sometimes you might be really outstanding at the interview, but you were just the wrong match. And sometimes as a candidate, we forget that it's a two-way process. The job is trying to assess us, as well as we're trying to assess the job as to suitability. So I think those were really good framework that from a candidate point of view will be really useful to hear feedback in that sort of way. The one thing I would probably wanted to add to that is, I think everything you said also applies to candidates that have been successful. Because many times as people looking for jobs, you line up interviews back to back and you just prepare yourself for it. So actually you may have another one in a week's time. And so being able to receive sort of that structured feedback the way you've just described it, I think is really important, even for the successful candidates. Thank you very much.
So you've demonstrated, hopefully to the listeners, how important feedback can be, both to unsuccessful and successful candidates. Now, it's not automatic that candidates receive feedback. So what I want to ask you, perhaps Aimee, is how do you promote a request from the interview, from the candidates, to get the feedback having had an interview?
Thanks. Another good question, Ellis. And, you know, it isn't a compulsory thing either as well, but I think it's about that relationship you build up with the employer and the appointing panel members as well. So I do take several opportunities to remind the employers that the role of the faculty assessor does include providing feedback. So I will tend to do that in the pre-interview conversations with the panel, and once we've had the post-interview conversations, again remind employers that the role of the faculty does include feeding back as well, and suggest the timing for that. I've also then, when I've had to send in my interview notes back to the HR people and departments, again, I remind people that I'm here to provide feedback if candidates would find that useful as well. So there's lots of opportunities as assessors to provide that reminder that it's an important role of the faculty being on the panel to provide that feedback as well to successful and unsuccessful candidates as well. But also, I think as an assessor, it's not our message to deliver. They still have that responsibility to give the initial, we haven't appointed you today thing. So it's complementary to theirs, to the feedback that the employer may give. And I think, you know, we have to focus on improving people's chances for the future and those interviews that are coming up, whether that's next week or next month as well. So I think it's really important that we can do that. And I think the timing is important as well. So, you know, too soon or too long, a gap between the interview and the feedback is important as well to consider. But yeah, I think that's some of the techniques that I use. Thanks.
Thanks, Aimee. Anna, could I ask you, as somebody who now has successfully obtained a consultant post, but was unsuccessful in a previous interview and received feedback from the faculty assessor after that interview, can you tell me about how the feedback was useful to you?
Yes, of course, Ellis, thank you. We all know that being unsuccessful at an interview can be particularly disappointing. In my experience, it was really upsetting, and I felt it was a failure. On the other hand, it can be seen as an opportunity to learn about yourself and your performance. In my experience, I firstly received the feedback from the employer, which was useful and helped me in understanding what went well and what went not as well. Only later, though, I proactively asked for a feedback from the faculty advisor. In this case, in this instance, the faculty advisor provided a very sensitive and constructive feedback. It was given thoroughly and also, if we can say, personalized, tailored on my own performance and also my background. We went through all the questions, starting from the presentation up until the last question. The feedback was designed to help me, Anna, in succeeding in a future job application. So they were able to highlight what experiences, knowledge, and skills were fundamental for the role I applied for. And they helped me in reflecting on whether that job in that point in time of my career was the right one for me. So I also had a really constructive conversation around whether it was worth exploring other roles. So for me, it was really helpful, and I would always advocate other candidates in asking for this feedback from the faculty.
And if I could just come in there, if that's okay, Ellis, I think, thanks, Anna, for sharing your experience. It's really interesting and useful to hear that the feedback that assessors and employers provide has been helpful for you. And I think what I would just add to this is actually most people do take up the offer. And I think, you know, that's my experience from having sat on AAC panels. So most people do take up that offer, and it's a really important role of the faculty to provide that feedback and tailor it, as you were saying.
Thank you.
Just really quickly as well, just to add, I had a situation where I was successful at the AAC panel, and I was really impressed by the assessor, because I'm guessing it's an unusual request to ask for feedback after being successful. And actually, they were incredibly understanding and incredibly welcoming in that. And essentially what Anna said was exactly what they've done. They sort of took me through my performance. They went through what they thought were my strengths that I wasn't aware of. And that was really insightful, because you were so overwhelmed by the emotion that you don't really observe these things. So they took through my strengths, and they took me through areas that are my weakness that I might need to work on. And we even touched on a little bit of what I might want to do with myself in the future. And that was really incredible signposting that I just thought it was going over and above. And it was fantastic to be able to get that sort of feedback even after a successful AAC panel. So I would definitely advocate for feedback for all candidates, whether they've been successful or unsuccessful.
Thank you very much. And I have to say, you know, that both myself and other assessors, it's very nice when you do get positive comments back from candidates who've received feedback. Thank you very much, colleagues, for helping us with this podcast. To the assessors who've been listening, we hope you found this podcast helpful. We thank you, of course, for volunteering to be an assessor. The faculty needs your help, and we hope that listening to this podcast will help you improve your contribution to the appointment process.